and it's really lovely to have you here. Just a little bit about the event. So the event is in collaboration with the Oxfordshire Climate and Ecological Bill Alliance, and it's part of the Oxford Human Rights Festival, which was founded in 2003. It's hosted by the Centre for Development and Emergency Practice in the School of Architecture at Oxford Brookes University, which we're really pleased to have their support. So as you can see from my virtual background, there's a lot of support for the CEE bill in the room tonight. We've got representatives here from the WI, the Ramblers, organisations such as Greener Henley, you might like to wave if you're here, Abingdon Carbon Cutters, Fossil Free Oxfordshire, and Low Carbon Oxford North and West, Cyclox, Green Gym, the Good Food Oxford, Cultivate, Marston Community Garden, Woodland Trust, I could go on. We also have faith groups represented by the Bishop of Reading, Green Christian and Earth and Faith Farringdon. And we're also happy to welcome members of Witney Town, Oxford City and Oxford County Council. And finally, we are especially delighted to be joined by some students from Charlton Primary, Cheney and Thomas Reid Primary. So we've got a really packed programme this evening when we will consider where we are as a nation on climate action. We're going to present a summary of the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, and we'll have plenty of opportunities to ask our panelists questions. And this session is being recorded and streamed live on Facebook. So if you don't want your face to show up at any time, or you don't want to be heard, then you can keep your video off. You could also go over onto Facebook and then you'll be completely invisible. If you've got a question at any time, as I was saying earlier, please put it into the chat. Some of them will be read out by panelists, to the panelists. Others may be answered by the panelists in the chat, so you may get a response in the chat. It's really helpful for us if you do put a Q at the beginning of a question, if it's a question rather than a comment, and a Q with an S if you're happy to actually say that question. And if you know who you want to ask the question of, then please put that in as well. It'd be really, really good if you can stay on mute. So if you can just check that now, it would be really helpful to stay on mute unless you have been specifically asked by me to put a question, or you're one of the speakers or panelists who are speaking tonight. And I'm sure you understand that if you do use hate speech, we're not going to tolerate that and you will be removed from the session. So I wonder if we could now just have the results of that Mentimeter up. Is that possible? Yes. Oh, okay. Well, what a surprise. So should the UK update its climate change legislation? So that's a yes. Obviously, we've not said how it should be updated, but a few people are not sure. Just the one person thinks it's fine how it is, but vast majority of people on this call today do think it should be updated. Thank you. You can take that away now. Okay, so we've got a great panel here tonight, and I'm very pleased because I'm now going to be joined on the screen by them one by one. So my name's Thalia Carr, and I work as a facilitator and coach within the sustainability sector, and I'm your host for this evening. And we're really thrilled to have a panel with broad experience and expertise to answer your questions. So we invited all the six Oxfordshire MPs, as we would love to see this bill get cross-party support. And we are pleased that 2 of them have accepted our invitation. Obviously, they're busy as well, and they're able to come just for the first half hour. I'm not sure if they're in the room. I've not been able to keep an eye on that. But they are Anneliese DODDS, who's the MP for Oxford East and the Labour Shadow Chancellor. Brilliant, thank you, Anneliese, good to see you. And Layla MORAN, who's the MP for Oxford West and Abingdon. Brilliant, thank you, Layla. And she's also the Liberal Democrat spokesman for Foreign Affairs and International Development. Also in the room, we have Clare Shakya, who's the director of the International Institute for Environment and Development's Climate Change Research Group. And I hope she's going to come up, yeah. And Professor Nick Eyre. Professor Nick Eyre is the Professor of Energy and Climate Policy at the University of Oxford. He's the director of the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, and he's the co-director of the Oxford Martin programme on integrating renewable energy. We also have EJ Fawcett from the UK Student Climate Network. EJ is a non-binary school student and youth climate activist. We have Mike Barry, who's a strategic advisor, speaker and commentator on sustainable business, who developed, launched and implemented Marks and Spencer's groundbreaking sustainability programme, which you may know of, called Plan A. We also have Charles Secrett. He is an advisor on the CEE Bill Alliance team and a former director of the Friends of the Earth. Charles has also worked with a wide variety of governments, companies and organisations on some of the most critical environmental and sustainability issues of our times. We have Jane King. She coordinates the CEE Bill Alliance building team and specialises in food, farming and nature. And Jane is a freelance curator and project manager working with scientists to raise awareness of the climate and ecological emergency through multimedia arts projects and events. And last but absolutely not least, we have Estelle Bailey, who is the chief executive of the Berks, Bucks and Oxon Wildlife Trust. And you can ask her questions about natural solutions to climate change, biodiversity, soil, water and food security and nature conservation. And I'm wondering if we've reached our limit on the number of people that we can highlight, and she's not able to be highlighted at the minute, but I'm sure she'll come on, well, she will come on later. So maybe you can wave and maybe some people will be able to see you, Estelle. Oh, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so without more ado, because we have our two MPs with us tonight, we're going to go straight to them. And it would be great to have just on the screen to have Anneliese and Layla. That would be lovely. And I'm going to ask both of you just this one thing, which is, can you give us one thing which you recognise as important in the bill and one thing that you find challenging? And maybe we could start with Anneliese.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really, really good to be here. First of all, fantastic to be with so many different groups and individuals who've done so much for our environment. I would say the most important thing about this bill are the principles within it. They're principles that certainly my party strongly supports. I guess the challenging aspect is, as with any such bill, whether it's going to be possible for it to be selected for debate and then get into legislation. From my point of view, I think it's really important that we view every piece of legislation actually as one where we need to make sure that there is a strong environmental focus. And certainly as Shadow Chancellor, I've been very clear that every single budget line should be tested against its contribution to net zero or otherwise.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much. And Layla Moran.
Well, also lovely to see you all. And it's incredible, I think, the groundswell of support for these issues, but I'm always especially proud of our area because it does always seem like we lead from the front, and it's I'm sure I speak for Anneliese as well. It gives us a lot of ammunition to go into the House with when we are trying to make the positive case, and I couldn't agree more about the principles behind the bill. This government, just to reflect a moment on the lack of ambition, they've come out with a 10-point plan which seems to cover all bases, except when you scratch under the surface, the £12 billion, which was nowhere near enough to begin with. Actually, only £4 billion of that is new money. And you compare that to France and Germany, who combined are ploughing £63 billion into their recovery from coronavirus that is genuinely going to be much more green than ours. And I think we are missing an enormous opportunity. So the Liberal Democrats support this bill, and we will support the bill in whatever form it takes. Actually, the bits of the bill that we think will get into legislation sooner than later are the amendments that are taken from the bill that are being attached to the Environment Bill, and we are fully supportive of that. And I think the bit of the bill that really makes my heart sing, and still is the poorer sister of other parts of this movement, is the points around biodiversity. It is so underappreciated how important this is as part of the climate emergency. There is a biodiversity that I think is showing itself in the coronavirus pandemic. It's the bit of this pandemic that makes further pandemics more likely if we don't get on top of this. It's the bit that reinforces reinforces why it's important to preserve as much green space as possible, why rewilding and betterment are all such important things. And I'm so happy that this bill puts that front and centre. So I fully support it. I look forward to continuing to support it, and also to keep working with the incredible groups that we have locally. We're so lucky to have you guys as a resource.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you both of you, and thank you so much both of you for coming as well, and for being prepared to allow us to ask you a few questions. What we're going to do just right now though is to have, I'm going to ask Mike Barry to come and just put the bill into perspective, look back at what we actually have done, you know, what we're building on, and also what business needs in order to make progress. So over to you, Mike. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm Mike. I've spent 20 years in the world of consumer goods in global supply chains, you know, thousands of factories, farms, fields, forests, fisheries, dealing with these issues. So I understand what we're trying to achieve here today. Now, what we're about to hear is a powerful scientific and moral call for action on the climate emergency. And I'm going to add a third voice, a business voice, that says there is an imperative for business to be part of this discussion and support what's being discussed today. And I'm going to frame it very briefly because we've got so much to get through today. And I'm just going to make 3 brief points about why this matters to business. The first is expectation. Every survey I see now says society as a whole expects business to step forward and be part of the solution, not just the problem. Even 2 years ago, a small number of people were asking for change. Now I'm hearing it from citizens who shop with these businesses. I'm hearing it from the people who work for these businesses. I'm hearing from their investors. All around business, people are saying step forward, step up, and help deal with this problem. The second thing I'm seeing is the need for resilience. I've stood in fields with farmers in punishing drought. I've seen shops flooded, I've seen factories flooded. All around the world, the realities of the climate crisis are becoming real through extreme weather events. It's hitting prices, it's hitting availability, it's hitting quality. Business has to respond and make itself more resilient in the face of the climate emergency. But the third thing, the most exciting thing for me, is opportunity. We're already starting to see marketplaces be disrupted by the climate opportunity. The shift from the internal combustion engine to the electric car, from a meat-based diet to a plant-based one, from throwaway fast fashion to resale platforms. Businesses that are bold and brave right now will future-proof themselves and be part of the new marketplace. Those that dawdle will become stranded assets, irrelevant and rapidly cast aside. Business has to change. So there are 3 broad frames. And I want to finish off with just 3 points then specifically about the bill and why it's so important for business. The first is the point that Layla made about climate and nature. Business is already living this. Business already recognises that soil is being lost across the planet, the soil that provides our food system. There's probably only 60 harvesters left on the planet. Think about that, 60 harvesters. Already 700 million people a day go to bed hungry. Something we take for granted here in the UK, that we have the food on the plate, most people anyway. But the other side of the world, that's not for sure. We've got to feed another 2 billion people on the planet as well. So the ecological systems that provide our food are under huge pressure from biodiversity loss and from the climate crisis. And already again, we're seeing the reform of the UK farm subsidy system around the environmental land management scheme. Now, again, people can push for more from that. But for the first time, a major subsidy system for farmers in the world is starting to put nature good at the heart of that. And I, as a food retailer, have to be part of that discussion. We're seeing reforestation happen on a huge scale. We're seeing the emergence of carbon markets based upon natural systems. And of course, the Global Resources Initiative, which is driving big business globally to look at its deforestation footprint wherever in the world it happens. So business is starting to understand that nature and climate change are locked together, and we need to enact on the 2 together. The second point I'm going to make in support of the bill is its focus on our global supply chains, our consumption footprint. For many big businesses, 90% of their carbon footprint is associated with their supply chains. And many of those supply chains are across the world, as I've already noted. Business is already stepping forward to commit to act upon that. Even in the middle of the pandemic, the British Retail Consortium has just brought together 63 British retailers to commit to become net zero 1, 2, and 3 scopes by 2040. And that's all about action here in the UK, but action globally as well. They're measuring those footprints, they're acting on those footprints as well. Other companies, Tesco's, Unilever, Nestle, Coca-Cola, European partners, have set scope 3 global footprint reduction targets as well. So businesses working with the grain of this bill. And the final point on citizens and society. We cannot have a net zero future where it's just about a small number of billionaires emerging because they've backed the right technology. I'm really glad that brought electric cars to the marketplace, new solutions that we need. Brilliant, well done them. I don't denigrate them, but we need a system whereby everybody in society is heard, everybody in society is involved. So citizens' assemblies, for me as a businessman, are critically important here. It is not enough for a small number of the elite to sit in a boardroom or a parliamentary chamber making decisions on behalf of society. If society is to trust the great changes that we need, and they're huge, huge changes to our way of life, they have to be involved. So link climate and nature, make sure that we measure our consumption footprint and act upon it, involve citizens as well. So that's my pitch. I'm really clear. Business is part of the problem, a significant part of today's climate crisis. It has to make itself more resilient in the face of pressure. But above all, the businesses that are bold and brave will win in new marketplaces in the future. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Mike. That's really helpful. And now I think it would be good if we can bring Anneliese DODDS and Layla MORAN back on. And our panelists would actually like to ask you some questions, starting with EJ. And maybe EJ could be spotlighted too. Over to you, EJ.
Right, so first of all, just want to say thank you to both of you for coming on. It's great to see our local politicians taking an interest in what we as climate groups have been up to. So my question actually goes to both of you. And as I'm sure both of you know, for me as a young person and for other young people, we've kind of been watching in abject terror as not just our future, but our presents are kind of slipping away in front of us. So my question to both of you is, what will it take to get this bill passed? What will it take to get the climate justice that we need as young people and that we need as a society?
I don't know who would like to start with that one.
I'll start.
Okay.
EJ, first of all credit to you and others. And you'll remember that protest that you guys did on Bond Square years ago, and Parliament hadn't discussed climate change on the floor of the House for over 2 years at that point. And I made a solemn promise that I would go back and do something, and I called the first one. And I'm not taking any credit for any of it, because it was you and it was your generation and it was the movement that you've built and everyone who has rallied around that movement that I think has seen the political winds shift. And I was delighted, actually. By the way, it is basically a year since last election. Whether you want to remember that date or not, I think will depend on various perspectives. But I was delighted that at the last election, climate change was a top agenda item. And that should have been the case for decades before that point. But it took until the last election to do it. And it was all credit to you and that movement that was built that we got there. But your question specifically is, what is it going to take? And the answer to your question, EJ, is a change of government. And I'm sorry to say that whilst the Conservatives have seen that it is in very much their interest to look green and sound green, that when you actually drill down into their promises and what they're doing, a really good example, a really good local example, is there's a review that has just been set up again of the A34. And the premise of the review is, how do we get more cars traveling along the A34 faster? And I've secured a meeting with the roads minister, because I think that's the wrong question. It shouldn't be, how do we get more cars traveling faster? It should be, how do we get people out of cars full stop? How do we achieve those fundamental shifts in society that we need? And I'm sorry to say, I don't think the government gets it in the way that they need to create that massive change that we are going to need. That is very much espoused in this bill, but I don't think it was ever going to take one bill. I think it's going to take fundamentally a different approach to how government's done in this country to actually achieve this.
Thank you. And Anneliese, I don't know what you would like to say in response to what does it take?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks very much, EJ. And I've got a feeling that maybe you were at that event organised by the City Council as well recently. Yeah, I thought I recognised you, and thanks for all that you're doing and everybody else. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Layla said. I think that, first of all, Parliament has decided, it's agreed that we are experiencing a climate emergency. So if we're in an emergency, we don't just sit back, we act like there's an emergency immediately. And that means that, just as we've been talking about, environmental issues, and particularly the drive to net zero, but ecological matters as well, must be considered in relation to every policy area. I find it pretty astonishing, to be honest. Last year, when we had, of course, the hottest year on record, the hottest day on record, sorry, I was the only MP who stated that in the House of Commons. I find that really pretty astonishing, that we're breaking through those barriers already in our own country. We've seen railway lines being washed away because of the climate crisis in our own country, but we're not behaving like there's an emergency. I mean, as I say, I agree with a lot of what Layla said, but I don't think we can wait until the next election. I think we've got to change now, not least because we've got the COP next year. So if there's even a whiff that the UK is hypocritical on a lot of these issues, it's going to be far harder for us to get that international agreement that is so desperately needed. So I think that means being very hard-headed, and it actually means being very honest about some of the trade-offs that exist here. I think when we look at some of the industries, for example, that are the most carbon heavy, I think there's a lot of concern within those industries, with people saying, well, hang on a minute, when there's been industrial adjustment before, we've just been left to fend for ourselves, like in the pit villages. We just had to deal with that on our own with no support. We've got to be honest about that as a society and say, we'll make sure the support is there. And, you know, I think mechanisms like citizens' assemblies, like what was used in Oxford City, were very useful, actually, because they got people to face up to those issues, be honest about them, and say, look, we together have got to deal with them. So it really can be that just transition. But my goodness, we've got to hurry up about it.
Thank you very much. I see that Estelle would also like to ask a question. Estelle Bailey has a question she's keen to ask. If you can come up.
Hi. I don't know if you can actually see me now or not, if I'm on the screen, but anyway, hello to you both. It's lovely to see you. I'm so delighted to see you up on the stage here and kind of, you know, tackling these big issues head on and not being afraid actually to answer these questions, which is absolutely fantastic. So you'll know, you know, I'm from the Wildlife Trust and here on your local patch represent a lot of people actually standing up for nature. Now, we're on the cusp of quite a moment as we leave the EU. We've got the Environment Bill, which is passing through government at the moment, through Parliament, and it does fall a long way short of putting in measures to tackle the climate and nature emergency. While it's good, it could be strengthened. I know that we're talking to other partners in all of this in the Green UK. But do you see there being a conflict between the Environment Bill and this proposed bill? My anxiety is that private members' bills tend to kind of fall short and don't quite make it over the line. So what can we do to make sure that we get the right measures in the right places to bring about change for nature and climate?
So who's Anneliese? Maybe you'd like to go first for a change.
Yeah, sure. And thanks so much for that, Estelle, and thanks for everything that you and all of the members actually of the Wildlife Trust do. It's so important. And, you know, I see it all around the city, actually, as well as across Oxfordshire. I mean, I think this is about, as I mentioned before, I think it's about looking at every bit of legislation, not thinking that we can hive this off somewhere else, but looking at every piece of legislation as having environmental elements to it. That includes, you know, for example, the comprehensive spending review that we just had, where we did not have a proper assessment of the impact of different measures within it on the environment. We certainly did not have that with the infrastructure plan at all. I think it's very instructive that the front cover of it was completely empty roads, perhaps, you know, sending us a bit of a signal there in terms of the direction, unfortunately, of government policy. So we've got to hardwire this into every aspect of legislation. How can we do that more effectively? I do think it's through the kind of mobilisation that we see here. It's through that kind of contact. But I think government's got to take a lot more responsibility for this as well. So we've seen the so-called Green Book being rewritten. Actually, some people on the call, Charles Secrett's done really excellent work in this kind of area, and others. We need to actually make those rules and those procedures bite now. They can't just be on paper. They've really got to be part of the run of the mill of government decision making.
Great, thank you. And Layla, would you have something to add to that? Or
I do. I mean, on your point around private members' bills, Estelle, as those who are parliamentary geeks know, unless it's one of the top sort of 5 bills and it's pretty much something the government wanted to do anyway, they tend not to get through. But that doesn't mean that they aren't really valuable as campaigning tools. And what I think this bill has done, and just by virtue of 230 people in a room, I mean, this is absolutely incredible, even for Zoom, shows that there's huge support for the principles behind this. But it needs to apply to not just one bill, and the Environment Bill is the obvious one to tag this on, but one that I know, and I think I've seen Bebout talk about this as well. I'm really concerned about the planning white paper. That is coming through Parliament, or coming to Parliament at some point soon. It seems to be a complete wasted opportunity. And I shan't bore people with the details, but I'm really very much a geek on this now. And I run an all-party group on heritage and culture, and we are trying to raise the alarm in the House, because one of the things that this proposed bill is not going to do is protect the environment. It's far too broad brush. It's essentially going to be a developer's charter. At the very time when we should be preserving as much of our precious green spaces as we possibly can. So every time that there is an opportunity to raise these principles and the specifics of what's in the bill, we have to. And I agree absolutely with Anneliese, we have to do things now, but there is going to, in terms of that fundamental shift in the view, unfortunately, I think we're some way away. And someone in the chat says, what are we doing to engage our Conservative colleagues? I certainly keep trying to talk to them about all sorts of different issues. I'm sorry to say some of them have gone to ground recently, although I'm on Any Questions with Robert Courts later, albeit remotely. So maybe I'll try and crowbar some of this in. I'll do my best.
thank you. I wonder, can we ask you just one more question? I know you said you had half an hour. Will you be okay for one more question? In that case, I'd like to ask Charles Secrett if you would ask your question that you have for both the MPs, and then we'll let them finish their half hour with us. Charles, would you like to come? Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. And welcome everyone, and particularly to Anneliese and Layla for coming along tonight. I think you're already showing up your 4 Oxford Tory colleagues in a very bad light, who aren't here today, but who were invited. Just one thing before my question, I must just say, this campaign model has been used very successfully to drive 8 private members' bills through Parliament when the government has initially objected to it. The last time being the Climate Change Act. So we're pretty confident that this type of mobilisation works, and it's going to work with this bill too, even if it might take some while. But my question is this. Jolly glad that the Liberal Democrats back the bill, and that Anneliese, you and Labour, and you are doing a great job as Shadow Secretary of State, Shadow Treasury, Shadow Chancellor, if I may say so, raising these green issues. But what we know is that science tells us the world has to keep average atmospheric temperature rises to below 1.5 degrees centigrade to avoid chaos. And we are virtually used up in the UK all our available carbon budget to help meet that target. So my question is this: will you both use your party opposition powers to press for the nature and climate clauses of the bill to be reflected in whatever legislative opportunity there is? And there is still opportunity with the Environment Bill going through its last stages in Parliament to push 1.5 onto the statute books, as well as to plug some big glaring holes in the Climate Change Act, which this bill does. And also, will you use your influence to make sure that the UK position at the Conference of Parties for the Paris Agreement next November reflects these climate and nature clauses? Because that's what you can do as an opposition.
Layla, you're unmuted, so let's start with you.
Yes, absolutely. And that is what I aim to do all the time. In my current brief as Foreign Affairs and International Development spokes, the way I've been pushing this is, showing my deep concern for the cut to 0.7% to 0.5, because actually a lot of that money was going to other nations that need to be part of this. and was going towards meeting their climate objectives. This is not just something one country can do alone. And you know, English exceptionalism is alive and well in all parts of government. And I personally think that actually this is the moment to be upping the percentage of our GDP that we are helping other countries with, particularly to tackle this emergency. We have more resources than them. We have to ensure that this is something we tackle as an entire planet. And that's one example of a number of different ways that I'm trying to do this. But to the main point about COP, I mean, actually, we've got a sort of a summit that's happening, I think, tomorrow as well, and it's the Climate Ambitions Summit. And I think every single opportunity that we have to pressure the government, I'm very hopeful, because I briefed the Any Questions producer that this was coming up, that, you know, actually every opportunity we've got to talk about this and point out to the government they're not doing enough. That's the first step, but then to give good, positive other things they can do. And that's what this bill gives us, is that toolkit that we can then point to. So it is a really valuable tool. I completely agree with you, just because it might not go through immediately all in one go, that we shouldn't be aiming for every single bit of it to be implemented in some way.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anneliese.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm going to have to be speedy here. I mean, on COP, I mean, I very much agree with that. And I think it feels like a long way away now, but it really isn't, obviously. You know, it's really not very long in planning terms. Certainly, I think we've got to work really, really hard to have very, very strong bilateral relationships. I suppose to say that particularly from the point of view of my party, but we've got to make sure, you know, for example, in relation to New Zealand, Australia, as well, that we're going to have a really coherent, strong, you know, hopefully if we can get to a more shared position, you know, just thinking about what's kind of sometimes derailed stronger positions in the past, right? We've got to have that discussion now. We've got to have very strong relationships with the international trade union movement, I think, as well, so that we've got a coherent position there, so that we don't have anything being kind of watered down because of those concerns around transition that I talked about before, which I really think we can deal with when we've got that ambition, and it can't be a reason not to deal with the climate crisis. I mean, I agree with you about the Environment Bill and the necessity to make sure that's strong enough. I would just also mention the fabled net zero review, of course, for the Treasury as well. I would mention the fact that we still have got export finance, which is supporting polluting industries. The fact that we still haven't been moving ahead. I don't know if people saw there was actually a spoof by a campaign group recently saying that there was going to be more of a pro-climate bias around some of the bank's activities, and it was shown to have been a spoof. We need to have much, much more being done through the financial system as well, going with the grain actually of quite a lot of what many investors are pushing for. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and it needs to be done quickly. And I think those principles do need to be running through all of those activities.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Anneliese DODDS and Layla MORAN, for giving us your time this evening, for allowing us to ask you difficult questions, and for being so positive about what you hope to do to represent us, really, as we move forward and hopefully get some real action on climate change. And we do understand that you have to go, so thank you for being here, and goodbye. And now I would like to ask Charles and Jane, if you would come up. So I realised that we've got this far. We wanted to do this at this stage so that we had this time to ask the MPs the questions, but you haven't actually had an overview of the CEE Bill, and that is what Charles and Jane are going to give you now. Have their slides up as well, I guess. Go for it when you're ready.
Yeah, this is over to Jane. She is going to introduce our presentation.
Thanks, Thalia. That's great. So I'm quite inspired now by everything I've heard so far, but we can kind of pull it all together now to show you what the bill's about on these few slides. So can you just move to the next slide? Thanks. So what is the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill? Well, it's a joined up approach to the climate and ecological emergency, and it's focusing on urgency, the science, targets, fairness and accountability. And the bill emphasises the interconnected nature of the climate and the natural world, something that Mike Berry talked about earlier. Because if we decarbonise the economy, but we don't stop destroying the natural world, we won't prevent the Earth systems from breaking down. Can I have the next slide? And so why do we need the bill? Well, as we've just heard, neither the government nor Parliament are acting with enough urgency. And the bill enshrines into law the commitment to reduce emissions to net zero urgently, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade in line with our Paris Agreement commitments. So the government's target of 2050 is just far too late. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, says we have to halve emissions by 2030 to have a chance of reaching net zero by 2050. They also say that just gives us a 50-50 chance of limiting temperature, of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So we're relying upon the toss of a coin. And we must act fairly. We must embed fairness in everything that we do here. So the bill says that the government will be fully accountable for all emissions, all domestic emissions, including aviation and shipping, and they're just not included in calculations at the moment. Also, the government and UK companies will be responsible for emissions resulting throughout our domestic and our international supply chains, so our entire carbon footprint. The bill also stops unproven negative emissions technologies, so things like man-made carbon capture, from being used as an excuse to limit or delay cutting emissions from burning fossil fuels. So we cannot rely on technologies that don't yet exist and are not proven to work at scale. They might exist, but they're not proven to work at scale. And the government will be fully accountable for the protection and restoration of UK nature, with a focus on biodiversity, soils, and natural carbon sinks. And the government and UK companies will be responsible for stopping the damage caused to nature by our domestic and international supply chains, which deliver the goods that we all consume. So we will be accounting for the UK's entire environmental as well as emissions footprint. And how are we going to go about this? Well, we believe very strongly that we need to go through a process of deliberative democracy. So the bill makes provision for a representative citizens' assembly where government, parliament, scientists and citizens work together to create an emergency strategy to achieve the bill's objectives, but without undermining our parliamentary sovereignty or our unwritten constitution. So we think that a citizens' assembly can really empower MPs to make bold decisions based on the best evidence, but avoiding the polarising constraints of party politicking, while allowing people to have a real say in shaping the pathways for a fair and just transition to a zero carbon society and a thriving natural world. So how are we building the alliance? Well, we're building a broad alliance through all sections of society, and we're building a grassroots base and grassroots organisations. We're connecting with NGOs, with environmental NGOs and civil NGOs. We're connecting with businesses, MPs, political leaders, councils, faith groups, unions. So really building a strong alliance through all sections. and we are building regional alliance groups, and the Bill Alliance Oxfordshire is the first of these, and they are exemplary in the way that this can be done, because they've gone out, they've built a broad alliance with local like-minded organisations, they've put this event on, they've got MPs around the table and all of us to discuss these issues. So they're enabling that discussion to happen. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to engage with MPs, and we believe strongly that this needs to be cross-party engagement and not platforms where MPs are talking about single-party solutions that are so difficult to get past the other side. So we believe that we can win the argument through citizens' activism, authoritative science and evidence of the bill's economic and social benefits. Thank you.
So were you wanting to add something to that, Charles, or is that the presentation? Are we done?
No, I think that's a presentation, and Jane, you did it fantastically. I think it's over to others now, but if we can answer questions, very happy to do so. Brilliant,
thank you very much. Well, in that case, I think what we'll do is we'll move on to some questions for the panel that have already been sent in, and this would be the whole panel. So I wonder if we can get the whole panel's pictures up when that's possible. I know that what happens is the little pictures go all over the place and they're difficult to find again, but hopefully we'll locate everyone in a bit. And I've actually got a question for Nick Eyre, so I'm hoping he might come up on the screen here, from somebody called Adriana Figueiredo. I don't know if you're here, but whoever, it was sent in on the Eventbrite page which you were asked for. And the question is, Nick, what's your opinion on the need and extent of reform in the overall energy market design for achieving the zero carbon target by 2050? And we're hoping for a kind of a 1-minute answer, not a kind of 45-minute lecture, because that seems to me what that might need. But anyway, if you can give us some ideas on your opinion on the need and extent of reform in the overall energy market design for achieving the zero carbon target by 2050.
Yeah, thanks, Thalia, and thanks, Adriana, for the question. Yeah, it would be easier to answer it in an hour than a minute. I think the 1-minute answer is almost complete redesign of the energy market, because the energy sources we're going to have to use are going to be renewable, 100% renewable, and we're probably going to need to halve our energy demand. That's roughly the sorts of targets we should be looking to. And I'm just going to use the next few seconds to say that's why I'm slightly disappointed with some aspects of this bill, because I think there's a missed opportunity to talk more about the actions that are needed, not just the targets, but the actions. More renewable energy, less road building, less flying, frequent flyer levies, huge investment in insulation and low carbon heating systems. There's none of that represented in this bill, so I think there's a bit of a missed opportunity.
Thank you very much. And I have another question here as well. This one is from, actually it's for you as well, Nick. This one is from James Ackworth in Wantage, and he says, air source heat pumps can reduce CO2 emissions by 75%, household heating bills by 50%, and pay back their installation costs within 10 years, even when replacing mains gas. Should we not make the retrofitting of all housing stock obligatory with the support of government guaranteed cheap loans?
The very short answer to that is yes. I'm not sure all the data is right. I don't think you would actually halve your heating bill with an air source heat pump at the moment. You would certainly reduce your emissions by a lot, and by the time we've decarbonised electricity, which we should do by about 2035, you get 100%. So it's exactly the sort of thing that we need to be doing. The problem is they are expensive, and so the government's target of getting 600,000 installations a year by 2028 is simply not going to happen without very significant policy change. And I think, yeah, that policy change ultimately is going to have to be, you cannot use high carbon heating systems. Now that's a major change. It's a major cost for many people, so it would need to be brought in a sensible way with incentives to start with, building up the supply chain and the skills that are needed. There's quite a lot of work to do that. It's a non-trivial change, but yeah, in the long term, that's exactly the sort of route we need to be heading.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's a question in from Sarah. I'm not sure which Sarah. What can everyone here do tonight to put pressure on our Conservative MPs to back the bill? And that, I think, was directed to Charles.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much for that. This is the critical question. These campaigns work of building broad and deep coalitions of interest locally and nationally, as Oxford has been doing so fantastically well already, by keeping the pressure up. And by keeping the pressure up, we don't mean just at a national level, lobbying Parliament and building petitions and marching, but critically about constituents and voters constantly going back to their MPs and saying, look, this measure makes sense. So many of the clauses we have to do to fulfill our international obligations. Once this bill has become law, then the very type of sector developments that Nick was talking about actually then flow. This is an umbrella bill that shapes the whole economy in very critical ways. And by constantly going back and more voters and more organizations joining the coalition and holding the MPs' feet to the fire, if I can use that expression, so change happens. Because every MP wants to get re-elected. And if enough constituents are saying, hey, look, we're not going to vote for you unless you support this measure, then at that point, the MP goes back to their whip, to their party managers and say, look, this bill makes sense. I have to support it. My constituents are demanding it. That's what representative parliamentary democracy is all about. And I'll repeat again, every single private member's bill that this campaign model has been applied to has been passed by Parliament. And in some cases, overturning a majority that Blair had of 156. So with the Tories, 80 majority, with science on our side, with the essential nature of the crisis being recognised, this is a one way in which we can address it. And I'm sure that enough Tory MPs, by keeping the pressure up in the way that I've described, will then join with their opposition partners for a parliamentary majority so that the bill does become law. And in the meantime, the UK position at COP26 can reflect so many of these clauses, particularly on the climate and nature side, even before the bill becomes law. So there is so much that Tory MPs and opposition MPs can do to make change happen.
Thank you very much, Charles. And I would like to have, we've got a clip that was been sent in by some pupils at Thomas Reed Primary School. I'm hoping that that can be put up. That's also questions for the panel. I think they touch on a few things. So if you could have your pens ready to make notes, panel, and decide amongst you who's going to answer. Okay, here we go.
Our questions are about reducing carbon emissions to help stop global warming.
Why can't the government convert all petrol and diesel cars into electric cars for free?
When will the government replace the fuel stations with electric charging stations and create more around the country?
Most importantly, when will the UK become eco-friendly?
Okay, thank you. So most importantly, when will the UK become eco-friendly? But a lot of questions there about transport and electric cars. Would anybody on the panel like to take that on?
Yeah, I'm happy to give a factual answer, which is the government has now committed to all new cars being non-polluting from 2030. That's they originally said 2040, they brought it down to 2035. It's now 2030. Why have they made those changes? It's all the things that Charles has been talking about. Actually, it's been campaigning from the grassroots that's achieved that. It's certainly not been done by the car industry.
Is there anything else in there that anybody wanted to pick up on at all?
Yeah,
Just
go. Right.
a very, very quick point to a couple of brilliant questions there. This brings the citizen to the very, very heart of it. I think for us, we've got to be careful here as a group of 240 believers on this call to not to assume that 65 million people in Britain all share, you know, our view as well. We have to take them with us. So I think 2030 is just about the right time to be banning the sale of new petrol and diesel. It allows people to prepare to resell the current cars that they've got, to start to get used to it. I think if we brought a ban in on vehicles now, it would have been just too draconian, even though the science in some ways demands that that's what we do. The other point about charging stations, this is so important. We have to make it easy for people to participate in a mass scale with a decarbonised economy. So it's not enough just to say, get an electric car, hope for the best. The government needs to step in and drive the infrastructure that will make it easy for people to continue their daily lives using electric cars. And that's what I think is lacking at the moment. It's probably some ambition about electric infrastructure. But thank you for the school. I thought those were great questions.
And a quick word from Charles before we have another input from some children.
Yeah, and just to build on those answers, it means government spending money differently. And this was a point that Anneliese DODDS made in her presentation, and the work that she is genuinely doing as Shadow Chancellor. And that, again, it's about opposition parties, government MPs, but above all voters and interested organisations making sure that whoever is the actual Chancellor in charge of the Treasury makes the money available, whether it's for green electrical infrastructure or for a whole range of other green energy alternatives. We have the technologies, we're lacking the political will. The Treasury's got the money.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. And also, I think it'd be nice to hear from Marlborough School in Woodstock as well. So they've also sent in a clip.
I'm Jacob and I'm 12 from the Marlborough School in Woodstock. I hear about lots of bad things about the future and climate change. I hear about fires and floods nearly every day ruining lives. What would you say to your children about their future lives in a 2, 3 or 4 degree warmer world?
Thank you. I think this is a really important one. And Claire, would you like to say how we can talk to our children and other children?
I think it's really important so let me start by saying 10 years ago, I did find it very hard to talk to my own children about these issues. I think over the last few weeks, we've begun to see the world shift. And in the last few weeks, we've begun to see the commitments that we need that bring us much closer to 1.5 than we've ever been before. It's still not enough, but we are seeing that shift. So every 5 years under the Paris Agreement, there are these political moments, and we're in one now, and it'll continue up until this time next year. And this is the time to really push, both through our own citizen engagement and through the building these sorts of alliances. So I think it is scary for all of us, but for children particularly, and it's something that I think many of us feel hugely guilty about, that we haven't managed to make progress faster. But in the next 10 years, there is a moment of transition, and this moment of transition is where we're going to really see the truth of how the new society will emerge. And it's really important that we put social justice at the heart of that, so that it's not just about technological change, but it's also about inclusion, getting resources and rights down to communities so they can take action and feel empowered. So this next year is critical, but the next 10 years is critical. And it's now that we really need to push together and make sure through alliances like this that we're getting the change we want to see.
And EJ, I'd like to ask you, I know you've got your indication that you'd like to respond, but I also know that you've got, I think it's your pinned tweet on your Twitter feed about having to talk to somebody who was quite a bit younger than yourself. And I wonder if you'd like to bring that into your answer, or maybe you were going to anyway.
Yes, actually, I was going to. So for those of you who aren't following me on Twitter, why? It's amazing. You definitely should. But yeah, I have this tweet up, and it's from a protest in Abingdon. Well, it's more of an art installation. We put shoes up like all over the marketplace. Well, a section of it that was visible at least. And when I was stood there, moving out some of the shoes, a girl came up to me. She told me she was 6. I was a bit worried. I was like, why is there a random 6-year-old just walking around the marketplace? But she wanted to have a talk with me. She was wondering what we were doing, because as you can imagine, shoes on the marketplace, a bit weird. And then I said to her, oh, we're protesting about climate change. And she said to me, what's climate change? And then I just felt my heart just sink like a stone, because I'm 18. And if I'm honest, the climate crisis scares the ever-living daylights out of me. It's terrifying. How on earth are you meant to explain that to a child a third of your age? So what I did was I had just a quick think about it, and I decided to tell her the basic part of it, which is that we as a society, or we as people, are currently putting some bad gases into the air, and that it can be quite damaging. So what I'd say is that when you're interacting with someone who's a lot younger, someone under the age of 10, don't lie to them. Children know when you are lying to them. You have to tell the truth, but you don't have to say everything. Because the fact of the matter is, if we don't do something, there is a good chance that we are going to die, or that our quality of life will be extremely diminished. So do not lie about it. But what I would say is, you do not have to say everything, but you have to give the facts. And as someone gets older, when you're my sort of age, we are ready to hear it. Teenagers are ready to hear it, and teenagers are ready to speak out against it. So that was a bit of a mix-up answer because it's quite emotional. But yeah, young people, we're people. You can talk to us about it. You can explain it to us. And yeah, it's what I tell my younger sister. You know, we are in danger, but we can get out of it. And we will get out of it if we work together and we try hard.
Thank you, EJ. And I think, as ever, it's always it's always encouraging to hear you speak. What I'd like us to do now is just to have a little breath. So most of those questions came in before this event even started. We asked you if you would give us a question, and sometimes people emailed them, and some of them came from the Eventbrite. And as you will see in the chat box, we've got another question that we'd like you to have a look at on the Mentimeter, menti.com. And there's a link there in the chat box which takes you to a different tab, so you'll need to open it in a different tab. Here we go, it's up again. And the question we're going to ask you is to answer please in one word, and it is helpful if it's in one word because it's going to form a word cloud. One word, describe how you feel about the proposed climate and ecological emergency bill. And you know, you can be honest, you can feel that it's a great idea, or you can feel that it's not enough, and those were both 2 words, so try and get it down to 1. But if you could just have a look at that Menti now, I'm going to give you a chance to open up a new tab, or maybe open it up on a phone instead of on the laptop, and just give you a chance to look at that. And don't worry if you can't. If you're really struggling, you could put your 1 word in the chat, and I'm sure somebody will put it in the Menti for you. We've got an amazing Menti team out there somewhere. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave that open. I think we can remove the splash screen now. I think somebody's accidentally come off mute who isn't on the panel, or maybe the panel has, somebody in the panel's got a noisy family. That's also possible. Okay, no noisy families there. And what I'd like to do is, there's been so many questions in the chat that I'm just going to ask people to, I'm going to ask them these questions. I can't actually see just at the moment anybody who's wanting to speak up and say their own one, but maybe that will come through to me shortly. Okay, so a question for Estelle from David Knight is, what is the biggest possible natural carbon sink in Oxfordshire that we could help to protect?
Oh my word, what a great question. Okay, so 70% of the landscape in Oxfordshire is farmed. Okay, so that puts us at a kind of disadvantage to start off with, but actually it's, you know, that's not the end. We can do some really, really good stuff on farmed land. Looking at the bigger picture of different sorts of habitats that we could restore that capture carbon. So that's woodland, hedgerows. We know that over the last, well, since the 1970s, you know, we've had thousands of kilometres of hedgerows have been ripped out of farmlands. Putting those back would really, really help. So we'd like to see a big programme of hedgerow restoration across the county. Wetland restoration also, that does soak up carbon and locks it in. So anywhere that we can look at restoring ponds or riverine habitats or water meadows, that would be absolutely fantastic. And then the conversion to permanent pasture as well. So permanent pasture does lock up carbon. So this is all, you know, solutions that we can target at farmland areas. So it is entirely possible. So taking farmland out of kind of massive, you know, intensive production, putting it down to permanent pasture is a solution. You can still produce food off that, but you can also produce nature and a big carbon sink.
So I'm going to just push you a little bit further on that, Estelle, because this David was asking, you know, is there a particular, I think, large natural carbon sink that we should be helping to protect? So is there a woodland that is particularly under threat, or that we should make sure doesn't become under threat? Or I don't know if that's, you know,
it's quite hard because there's lots of pockets of great things. So this is about restoration, I think, as much as protection. And when you look at natural solutions, it is very much, you know, about the restoration piece. It's not just about protecting what we've got. That's not enough. We've got to grow that and grow the impact of it, which means restoring. So we can take the pockets of what is really good now, different sorts of maybe woodland habitats around Oxfordshire, Wytham Woods and all sorts of different places. I mean, we've got some amazing nature reserves as well, some really great space, some core areas, and we need to grow that and protect it. But beyond that, this is about restoration. I think that's a key message here, is turning to natural solutions as an answer to climate change. It has to be about restoration at this point.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I've got one coming for you, Mike. Can I hand this to Jane? Jane.
Thanks, Thalia. So I really appreciate what Estelle said there. This is where the bill speaks to how we can change this sort of thing through our supply chains. So at the moment, existing legislation isn't going to help, and it's quite unlikely that the latest reincarnation of the agricultural bill is going to help, because farming can't do this on its own. Farmers are getting blamed for this situation. They're getting blamed for the 70% of the UK that is agricultural land being an ecological desert, but they can't change that on their own because they're part of a huge global food market, and it restricts what they can do. So the food market controls this, controls what can be done, it controls what's grown, how it's grown, where it's grown. And so if we want to restore the countryside, we have to tackle the food market. And we believe that this bill can do that through our supply chains.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm guessing that, Mike, I can ask you a different question, because I saw a lot of nodding going on there when Jane was speaking. So I will do that. There's a question here from Ian Middleton, who says, how do you equate the need for consumption to drive retail businesses with the idea of reuse, renew, and sustainability? Retail is an important part of our economy, but it relies on people buying a lot of stuff. That's a difficult thing to rationalise within a green agenda, but it's right up your street, Mike. Yeah,
it's spot on. I'm going to answer that question. I'm just going to concur with Estelle and Jane there that the farming system needs to be fundamentally changed. That's partly about farmers. It's predominantly about the subsidy system. We're starting to see some progress there, as we mentioned, and the buyers of that food, the big retailers and the big brands. Now they've committed to net zero, so there is a pathway now to help farmers change that we need to see through. I'll say no more on that one. Now on the consumption one, let's face into that. Last year, the world consumed 130 billion pieces of clothing and footwear, every single one of which has got a substantial water, human rights, and a welfare environmental footprint embedded within it. Even if all those garments are made with 10% less energy than 10 years ago, the consumption rise is dwarfed. Now, COVID's put a spike right in the middle of that consumption model for clothing. We'll see where it rebounds to. But before COVID, it was heading to 200 billion garments by 2030. We need a fundamental shift to how we treat stuff. We've become sated on it. So I would say to anybody now, buy quality, buy only what you need, repair it when you finish with it, and we've got to help people do that. The rise of resale platforms is fundamentally disrupting fast fashion because it operates on such thin margins. Even if you lose 10 to 15 to 20% of your sales to the resale platforms, so people are buying secondhand or buying from a charity shop or being donated by family and friends, that destroys the fast fashion model. So people have to consume differently. But again, I go back to my point earlier, we have to make it easy for them. And it's not enough to send them a 200-page report that we might read. We need to find ways to access people's behaviors and ways of life to show them there is a different way. And the final point is, again, most of the supermarkets have got little trials going on at this moment about refill stations. And I know there's more and more small shops cropping up across Oxfordshire that do that full time. Brilliant. But the retailers can bring scale, and we need to encourage them to take it from a few pilot stores into all their shops. Then we start to see change in single-use plastic as well. It's a brilliant question. We need to change how we consume.
Brilliant. Okay. I've just got a question in here, which is from Liz Gould to everyone. And it says, to anyone, in fact, on the panel, to what extent do people understand about the Citizens' Assembly aspect of the bill and how best to raise awareness about this? And how will this bill connect to the global climate assembly that is now being promoted? So it's a question about the Citizens' Assembly, I think maybe for a little bit more clarity on that and how it connects to the global climate assembly. I'm guessing that that might be Charles and Jane, but it could be somebody else.
Sure, and start off on that. Jane, shall I start?
Yeah.
Very good question about the Global Citizens Assembly. We haven't worked that one out yet. So that's a challenge that is on our plate, and we've got to work out a way of doing that. But point well made. As far as National Citizens Assembly is concerned, well, there are a lot of myths that need to be dispelled. I mean, one of the first ones, and we get this back from Tory and Labour MPs the whole time, is that Parliament is sovereign in this country. You can't have a Citizens' Assembly set up, as this bill does, that tells Parliament what to do. That's not democratic. But of course, that's not what the bill does. What the bill does is it sets up a representative Citizens' Assembly, so one that reflects the great diversity of our country, to advise Parliament on what the people's solution, if I can use that terrible phrase, are to making the climate and nature strategy really work. Because the one thing that we do know is we can't leave this just to politicians. Leaving it to politicians has got us into the disaster that we currently face. So the Citizens' Assembly is seen as a very positive way of strengthening representative democracy. And another part of this is to help people, because it's an unfamiliar, forum or public tool, if I can use that expression, in this country. There's a lot of education that needs to go on, of demonstrating how well it's worked in other countries, like, for example, Ireland, when it came to deciding on what to do about abortion laws. Very moral, very polarizing issue that legislators in that country just had sort of said, well, we can't handle this. Well, the Citizens' Assembly there went a huge way to unifying the nation, a very religious nation, in a way forward that persuaded politicians what the will of the people were. And so I think that we need examples like that to show how valuable a Citizens' Assembly on climate and nature will be for helping politicians come to the right solutions, one that had popular support. And of course, that's critical with any piece of legislation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Did anybody else want to say anything on that? Add anything? Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, I'd just say a little bit from the point of view of someone who was fortunate enough to be involved in both the Oxford Citizens Assembly and the UK.
Nick, you're doing a bit of a Darth Vader on us. I don't know if that's just me or if that's you. It's yeah.
Volume.
Can we hear? Can you try again?
Can you hear me now?
You're still rather Darthy.
Okay. Somebody else then, Thalia. I'll see what I can do.
Claire, would you like to speak for Nick? Or
I think what the point that Nick, it can nod if I'm saying the right thing, but I think the point that Nick was making was the challenge of inclusion. If you have a citizen assembly that goes on for long enough, that actually everybody really understands. So the issue of forming citizens assemblies can be challenging if those involved are all coming from very different perspectives. It takes a while to build a shared understanding, and you can end up, if it's too short, with the lowest common denominator. But then if you make it longer, then it's easier for the richer members to stay with the process, and it's harder for the poorer members to do the same. I'd just say that, you know, there are, I would add the international experience. In some of the poorest countries, they've been through a process of deliberative engagement. It was held over a whole year, in which people came together for 2 or 3 days at a time and looking at evidence over that period. Some of them were experts, many of them were experts, but they came out with possibly the strongest expression of climate ambition ever as a result of that process. So done well and really thought through, and making sure that inclusion is not an issue and giving sufficient time to build that understanding, you can get very strong and very powerful expressions of ambition.
brilliant, thank you. We're coming to the end of the time for our questions. I have got a question here for EJ. EJ, I was trying to copy and paste, but I wasn't able to. So here we go. It's from Anne Miller. You may have seen it in the chat already. And she asks, what can we do as an older generation to support you, and you'll hear who you is in a minute, most effectively and practically? As a lifelong environmentalist who has been swimming against the time for 60 years, I really want to know how you and your young activists would like us to help you to get this message across to our MPs and others, but I have no idea where to start. So EJ, there you are, it's open to you.
Right, thank you. So there's an infinite number of things that adults can do, but I'll cut it down to the main ones because we don't want to be here all day, well, all night. So I think the single biggest thing that adults can do is show up. So show up to protests, show up to events, sign petitions, show up to vote. If you show up to the things you can show up to, then you are making one of the biggest differences you can make. When it comes to stuff like Youth Strike for Climate or XR Youth Oxford, often we need adults to show up and help, but also just having people who can vote showing their support means a great deal, because it shows members of parliament that although many young people might not be able to get them out of office yet, people who can are being supportive. And I'd say that the single other biggest thing is making the young people in your life, whether they're your children, your grandchildren, your friends' children, whoever they are, making them feel empowered. So whether that's simply gifting them an encyclopedia and spreading the knowledge, or letting them know that they can speak their mind in front of you, or whether it's pushing them to take up public speaking and then go and speak in front of their town council. Anything you can do to make young people feel empowered is so, so important, because it is so hard when you cannot vote and you feel like you do not have a voice. So any voice you can have means the world. So I'd say those are the two biggest things you can do. But just listen to young people, because it's not going to be the same for everyone and every situation is different. And the biggest thing you did in this call was ask. You let me use my voice. So thank you. And that's all I have to say on it.
Thank you, EJ. Yeah, a round of applause. Okay, so I want to give a real thank you to the panelists who've been busy kind of EJ for Prime Minister, yeah, who've been busy trying to keep up with all the questions in the chat, and I know some of them will have been answered and some won't. We are going to capture all that's in the chat, and we're trying to work on some ways that we might be passing some of those questions that were asked to the MPs who weren't able to be here or who chose not to be here, to pass them on so that they know what their constituents are asking. I'm afraid we're going to have to draw the panel discussion to an end now, but I know that people have been asking, what can I do, what, you know, and where's this all come from, and who are you all, the CEE Bill Alliance? Hadn't heard of you before. So I'm going to ask Tina now, if you could give us a little bit of a background on the Oxfordshire Alliance. And Tina's one of the founders of the Alliance, and she's going to just give us, tell us a little bit more about it. Thank you, Tina.
Thalia. Well, you might be rather surprised to hear that we only came together about a couple of months ago. And what brought us together? Well, despair about the plight of the planet and the postponement of COP26, and hope about the possibilities of the CEE Bill and the thought that it could plug gaps in the current legislation. And having realised that only one of our 6 Oxfordshire MPs supported the bill, i.e. Layla, we thought, well, let's try and arrange an event to promote the bill and persuade the other 5 MPs to support it too. And we've done this as a group of concerned citizens and climate activists by reaching out to the networks that we are already part of and asking them whether they would collaborate with us, and if so, to send statements of support and their logos. And as you can see from behind Thalia, there's lots of the logos that they've been sending to us. However, we haven't just been building alliances, we've also continued the ongoing conversations with MPs that many of us have been having for years. We've been engaging with our councillors at all levels, and we've been absolutely delighted that this has borne fruit, as was shown by the fact that in the last couple of weeks, first Oxford City Council unanimously passed a motion in support of the bill, and this was closely followed by the County Council passing a similar motion, this time with representatives from all the political parties voting in favour, and there was a resounding majority of 51 to 5. I'd like to read you very quickly some excerpts from a few of the statements of support from our alliances. So from Good Food Oxford, we need to take decisive action now and transform the food system from a contributor to climate change to being a part of the solution. From Parents for Future Oxford, as parents, we have an enormous interest in the future of our climate and applaud legislation like this that centres on a commitment to what is necessary if we are to achieve a safe future for our kids. I'm sure that resonates with EJ. And lastly, from the Low Carbon Hub, one of our larger partnerships, this is a social enterprise providing community energy projects such as solar panels and hydro systems. Our energy system is changing, but it's more than just the wires and switches that make up its physical infrastructure. It's a social system developed by people for people. And as we make the transition to zero carbon energy, the changes required will be just as much about people and the way they interact with technology as it is about technology. Communities and people need to be at the heart of our new energy system. And if that's inspired you and you want to join us, in the chat, you'll see an email address for how you can do that. And I would like to end by saying a huge thank you, first of all, to the panel, but also to the people you can't see, for all the teams behind the scenes who have worked tirelessly to achieve this event. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And what you don't know is how much Tina herself has done to make all of this happen. This has really been such an amazing group of people to work with. I'd just like to ask Estelle and Charles to come on and just to remind us of the action that we need to take, particularly around the bill. And while they're doing that, I'd really appreciate it if you would stop posting questions, but instead, if you want to post into the chat any action that you personally are going to commit to build momentum for the bill, that would be lovely. So it'd be great to have your actions. You know, I am going to, what are you going to do as a result of being on this tonight? So while they're speaking, listen to them, but maybe pop something in the chat at the same time. I'm not sure, is it Estelle starting?
Yeah, I can do. It's probably better. It's more appropriate actually if Charles kind of finishes. But I guess this has been a fantastic event actually. And it was kind of way off my radar, and I'm really, really pleased to have been involved and to have heard about the proposed bill and the extent of it. And I think that's the critical thing here. It's the extent of it. And we've seen other legislation come through, and it's been really quite bitty. This brings it together, but we need it across the whole of our legislative framework. There's no two ways about it. For nature, to restore nature, to begin to start the story of nature's restoration across the UK. And I'd said before, this is beyond protection now. There's not enough to protect to be able to start to deal with the climate crisis. We need £1 billion a year to invest in nature's recovery, which in the grand scheme of things is not a lot of money. The government have just given us 40 million now under the Green Recovery grant pot, and that's nothing, absolutely nothing. We need serious investment into nature if we're going to start tackling the climate crisis in this country alone. And beyond that, I think this is fantastic, this bill, for really reaching into the supply chains and getting to the kind of heart of what the issue is. There's stuff that we can all do, and I know, and I completely support EJ, and you know, that there is a real sort of anxiety and eco-anxiety for the younger generation. You know, beyond climate, it's about nature. The two are completely interrelated. We can't separate them. We've got to deal with them both as an issue together. But we can all do something locally. It's not just about government. This is about business. It's about the whole of society, and it's about us taking our personal action as well. And that can be something that's on your doorstep and your garden, doing something wildlife gardening, getting out into your local green space, doing something in hospitals, car parks, whatever. The whole story just adds up. But I think we're at a point now where we've got a huge opportunity as we come out of the EU. Not that I'm a fan of doing that by any means, but with the legislation that is coming into play now, I think it does strengthen the opportunity to restore nature at scale, and particularly through the agriculture bill. Agriculture, 70% of the farms landscape is farmed across the UK. That now gives us an opportunity to turn the tide on what has been a huge, huge issue. That's not the fault of the farmers. We're not blaming them. They've been asked to produce food. They've been asked to apply fertilizer, herbicide, pesticide, whatever. It's caused all sorts of huge issues. We've got habitat fragmentation. You know, huge amounts of habitats have been destroyed over years and years. We've got a chance now to put that right, and this is just the start of that journey. So everybody, please, this is about government, it's about us taking local action, it's about everybody pulling together to sort out this issue. We can do it. I absolutely believe that. You seem to have frozen.
Yeah, I froze, but it was, for me, it was you that froze.
Oh, right, okay, sorry.
Well, shall I just follow straight?
Go ahead. Sorry about the freezing.
That's okay, don't worry. Yeah, first of all, big thanks to fellow panelists, to everybody who's joined tonight in one way or another, even if you didn't get to ask a question directly. I hope you'll be able to take away something. And the thing that I hope everyone takes away is hope. If we lose hope, we've lost everything. And I think what this bill and the campaign, and particularly what Oxford Coalition has been able to pull together in such a short time, I mean, the whole campaign has only been running for 3 months, it is absolutely incredible. And if everyone wants sort of evidence of hopeful activity, it's what Tina and her colleagues have been able to pull together. And Thalia, thanks very much indeed for facilitating so well. That was a real juggling act that you had to do. If you want to find out more about the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill and the coalition of interest that already support it, just Google climate and ecological emergency bill, and all the relevant information comes up also in terms of what you can do to help push the bill forward. The final thing that I want to say is, you've heard me talk enough about getting active and holding MPs' feet to the fire. What's also important is to thank MPs and councillors when they do the right thing. And so I think it'd be great if people could write individually to Layla and Anneliese, on the one hand thanking them for participating and giving up part of Friday evening, but also keep pushing them on answering the difficult questions, because maybe it was just my jumble, but I noticed that neither of them answered either of my questions directly. So I will be going back to them and putting that question to them and keeping the pressure up. And don't let your 4 Tory MPs get away with it either. And the very final thing I'd say is, look, you've done something amazing in Oxford. Let other activist groups, and there are many of them in towns and cities all over the country, share with them what you've been able to do, because it's inspiring and it's hopeful. And that's what you do. Make connections, spread the word, work together. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Charles. And I'd just like to ask you not to drop off the call just yet if you're thinking, oh, it's almost wrapping up, because we are going to show you the word cloud right at the very end. So just hang on for that. I want to say my thank yous to all the people who have made this possible. Enormous gratitude to the people who designed and wrote the bill, first off, to our 2 MPs who actually attended, Anneliese DODDS and Layla MORAN, to all of our panelists who are incredibly busy people, to the Centre for Development and Emergency Practice at Oxford Brookes University, and in particular the director, Professor Catherine Brunn, and to the unseen power behind the Zoom, who is Elizabeth Lascar, who is, you know, if she'd gone down the tubes, you'd all have gone with her. Well, maybe not quite, but anyway, she's made it all happen. And this is part of the Oxfordshire Human Rights Festival. And to all the people in the Alliance who promoted the event, supported behind the scenes, invited speakers, talked to the media, went on the media, we've been on BBC Radio South. There are far too many to mention by name, although I would love to. And it has been an excellent example of people willingly collaborating about an issue we all feel passionately about. So join us. This is a brilliant team. This is one you want to be on, definitely. And finally, thank you to everyone who asked a question, especially our school students, and to all of you joining us either on Zoom or Facebook now or in the future. And we hope that you'll want to work alongside us to enable this bill to gather momentum. And finally, I would love to see the Mentimeter word cloud come up so that you can all see, I think the question was how you feel about the CEE bill now. So hopeful's a big one, optimistic, essential, like it, excited, positive, encouraged, important, determined, necessary, overdue, collaborative, love it. Isn't that a wonderful word cloud? So take that with you. Remember what Charles said to you about hope, and thank you everybody for coming, and goodbye.